At Christmas Eve, Aunt whispered, "You're so brave for coming." And I smiled, already planning not to come next year. I kept my eyes on the gravy boat like it was the most fascinating object I'd ever seen, nodding as if her words hadn't landed like a brick in my stomach. The dining room was too warm, the combination of oven heat and too many bodies in a too small space making the air thick. Fairy lights blinked lazily around the window, reflecting in the glass and turning everyone's faces into a double exposure. My fork hovered over the slice of ham I'd been cutting for 5 straight minutes, my hands stiff, my jaw sore from the polite smile I'd been wearing since I walked through the door. Aunt's hand rested briefly on my wrist, just enough pressure to say "I see you," not enough to draw attention. Her perfume smelled like the same cheap jasmine she's worn since I was a kid. On my other side, my cousin Luke was loudly explaining crypto to my grandfather. Dad was at the head of the table performing easygoing patriarch for the cousins, and Mum kept catching my eye, giving me that brittle half-smile that meant behave. Christmas carols played softly from someone's phone speaker, the kind of generic playlist that autofills if you type "festive" into Spotify. My chest felt tight. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears louder than Silent Night. It was the first time in 3 years I'd been to a family Christmas. I'm 28F, officially the difficult one on my mum's side, and the only reason I was even there was because my grandmother had a fall in October and suddenly everyone remembered words like family and time is short. Aunt, Mum's younger sister, had called me, voice soft and coaxing, and said, "Nan's been asking about you. You don't have to stay long. Just pop in." For her. If you grew up in a normal family, that probably sounds harmless. If you grew up in mine, you know that just pop in is never just anything. It's a full emotional marathon in a single afternoon. The last time I'd sat at that table was Christmas Eve 3 years ago, right before I went low contact with my parents. We'd had the usual performance. Matching paper crowns, bad jokes from the bonbons, Mum making passive-aggressive comments about my weight, Dad making jokes about therapy and snowflakes, me laughing along with my whole nervous system screaming. I'd left that night, gotten home, and had what I now know was a panic attack in my bathroom. Sliding down the tiles, chest tight, convinced I was dying. 2 weeks later, I started therapy for stress. 2 months after that, I told my parents I needed space. It did not go well. "We did our best," Mum had said, already crying before I finished the first sentence. "You've been watching too many American shows," Dad had scoffed. "All this trauma talk. We gave you everything." The next year, I booked a cheap Airbnb with friends for Christmas and didn't go to any family events. The year after that, I worked a double shift at the cafe and volunteered at a community lunch. Last year, I just stayed home with my housemate, watched dumb movies, ate bad pavlova, and realized halfway through the afternoon that my shoulders weren't up around my ears. This year, when Aunt called, part of me wanted to say no immediately. My therapist, bless her, had raised an eyebrow when I mentioned the invite. "What do you want to do?" she'd asked. Not "what should you do?" Not what will cause the least drama. Just what I wanted. The honest answer, I didn't know. I missed Nan. I missed parts of the chaos. I missed knowing the in-jokes and the rhythms of a family gathering, even if those rhythms used to grind me down. I also liked breathing and sleeping and not crying in supermarket car parks because I'd seen someone who looked like my dad. In the end, I made a deal with myself. Go, stay an hour, leave if my body started screaming. I told Aunt I'd come for a bit. I told my therapist my exit strategy, her words. I texted my best friend, Mia, and said, "If I send you a penguin emoji, call me with a fake emergency." I probably looked calm when I walked up Nan's driveway earlier that evening, balancing a trifle bowl and a weak smile. Inside, my heart was doing gymnastics. The house smelled like roast chicken, Glen 20, and that weird musty sweetness old houses get. I could hear the roar of voices before I even opened the door. Dad was the first one I saw. He was standing near the kitchen, beer in hand, laughing at something Uncle Rob had said. For a second, he looked like the dad from when I was 10, the one who let us put tinsel on his ears and pretended to hate it. Then he saw me and something shuddered in his face. like he'd slammed a door behind his eyes. "Well, well, look what the cat dragged in," he said, loud enough that the nearest four relatives turned to look. I handed my trifle to Aunt and forced a grin. "Hi, Dad." Mum bustled out from behind him, apron on, cheeks flushed. "Oh, she came," she said to the room, as if my presence were a surprise party she'd organized for herself. Then to me, quieter, "You look different." "I cut my hair," I said. It was true. I'd gone for a shaggy bob a month ago in a minor identity crisis. "Oh, that's it," she said, eyes already scanning me for other changes. "You're pale. Are you eating properly? Those inner-city cafes, you never know what's in the food." I'd been there less than 30 seconds. My therapist had warned me this might happen, that they'd slide straight back into old scripts as if the last 3 years hadn't happened. "Hi, everyone," Aunt had chirped, appearing at my elbow to rescue me, steering me toward the dining room. "Look who's here. Nat, sit next to me." And that's how I ended up at the long table with Aunt's fingers on my wrist, her whisper in my ear, the food congealing on my plate while my brain tried to do 13 things at once. Manage my facial expressions, monitor my heart rate, calculate my exit time, and field questions about how the city was. Luke turned to me mid-crypto explanation and said, "So, still doing that mental health course?" "I'm a social worker," I corrected, automatically. "Yeah, still doing that." He shrugged. Yeah, social work. Helping people who don't want to help themselves." He rolled his eyes like he'd heard Dad say it 100 times. "You'd be surprised," I said. "Most people want to help themselves. Systems don't let them." He blinked slowly, like I'd spoken in another language, then went back to explaining blockchains to Nan, who nodded politely and definitely understood none of it. Across the table, Dad was telling the story about the time I'd apparently refused to sit on Santa's lap as a kid. "Always been stubborn, this one," he said, pointing at me with his fork. "You couldn't tell her anything. Thought she knew better than everyone even at 5. Everyone laughed. I smiled tightly. The story wasn't exactly true. I remember being terrified of the bearded stranger and Mum hissing in my ear, "Don't make a scene, get on his lap," while my little body screamed no. But sure, stubborn is a nicer story than scared. After Aunt whispered that line about me being brave, she went back to her plate like nothing had happened. I took a breath that felt halfway between a sigh and a sob and tried to listen to the conversation about Christmas movies like a normal person. My brain kept snagging on her word. Brave. Brave for walking into a house full of people who still thought I'd overreacted to my own childhood? Brave for risking an evening with the man who once bellowed at me for half an hour because I embarrassed him in front of my cousins by crying at a joke about my weight? Brave for hugging the mother who told everyone at church that Natasha's just been going through a phase. She'll grow out of it. When I tried to talk about my depression, I didn't feel brave. I felt like the same scared kid in itchy Christmas tights, braced for the next comment. "Nat," Nan said suddenly from the far end of the table, her voice cutting through the noise. "You're quiet." Everyone looked at me like I'd been called on in class. "Just listening," I said. "Still living in that little unit?" she asked. "You like it?" I smiled properly for the first time all night. "Yeah, it's tiny, but it's mine." Dad snorted. "Matchbox," he muttered, "paying through the nose for a shoebox when you could be at home." Home meaning their house, where my stomach lived in a permanent knot. Mum jumped in quickly. "You know you're always welcome," she said, in that loaded tone that meant you're making a choice not to come. I nodded, non-committal. "I know. The thing about being back in that space is that my body remembered everything my brain had tried to reframe. The Christmas when Dad drank too much and called me princess in that mocking tone all night because I'd worn a dress he thought was too fancy. The year Mum gave me a scale as a present for your health. The way any attempt to set a boundary, saying I didn't want my texts read out loud, asking them not to make jokes about crazy people around me, leaving the room during a screaming match, was treated like betrayal. And yet, there were also the good bits layered over the bad like icing over a burnt cake. Nan's cinnamon biscuits, Aunt sneaking me extra roast potatoes, late-night board games with the cousins when the adults finally passed out. It was all mashed together in my head, impossible to separate. Halfway through dessert, Aunt leaned in again. "You okay?" she murmured. I considered lying. "Honestly," I said instead, "I feel like my insides are vibrating." She huffed a quiet laugh. "That bad, huh?" "That familiar," I said. She nodded slowly, eyes distant for a second, like she was listening to her own nervous system. "I get it," she said. "You know, when I told your mum you might not come," she said, "she's always making drama. I told her maybe she just doesn't like being shouted at." My spoon froze halfway to my mouth. "She tell you I said that?" "Of course not," Aunt said. "You know your mother." I did. That was the thing. That's why I'd stayed away for 3 years. "Why did you come?" Aunt asked, not accusing, just curious. I glanced down the table at Nan, who was telling Luke's girlfriend about how she used to make all the kids' clothes because nothing in the shops was decent. Her hands, twisted with arthritis, still moved as if holding invisible fabric. "Nan," I said simply. Aunt followed my gaze and her face softened. "Yeah," she said. She lit up when I told her. She paused. "You know you don't have to prove anything to anyone by being here, right?" I did not know that. My entire life had been a series of small, desperate proofs. That I was good, that I was loyal, that I wasn't as oversensitive as they said. That coming back after going low contact meant I was mature enough to handle things, not unforgiving or cruel. I shrugged. "I'm just trying something," I said. "And if something turns out to be bad for you?" she asked. I thought about the penguin emoji sitting unsent in my messages to Mia. "Then I leave." Aunt smiled, this sad, proud little curve of her mouth. "There's my brave girl," she said. I almost told her then that brave didn't feel like sitting at this table swallowing memories over lumpy custard. That brave, for me, had been all the small, quiet choices I'd made away from here. Turning my phone off at 9 p.m., not answering every guilt-laced text, staying in therapy even when it meant dredging up stuff I'd spent years laughing off. That brave might look, next year, like not coming at all. But Nan called my name then to ask if I still played piano. "I tell people you were our little prodigy." And the moment passed. After dessert, the chaos shifted into the lounge room for presents and the annual obligatory carols. I hung back in the kitchen, stacking plates more for something to do than actual helpfulness. Mum swooped in behind me. "Your aunt said you might not stay late," she said, voice light, too light. "I've got an early start tomorrow," I lied. I had nothing planned except sleeping in and maybe going to the beach. She sighed, long-suffering. "You know, we all have lives, Nat. You're not the only one who gets tired. But we make the effort. For family." There it was. The word that had been weaponized my whole life. Family. I rinsed a plate that didn't need rinsing. "I am making an effort," I said. "I'm here." She made a noise halfway between a scoff and a laugh. "For how long?" "As long as I can," I said. It was both an evasion and the truth. She put a stack of cutlery down with a clatter. "You know your father misses you," she said abruptly. "He doesn't say it, but he does. He doesn't understand why you've been distant." I bit back the urge to say he could have asked. Instead I said, "I've needed space." "Space from what?" she demanded. "We didn't beat you. We didn't starve you. We did our best." I felt that old familiar tug, the reflex to reassure her, to pet her guilt until it went back to sleep. "You're right, it wasn't that bad, I'm overreacting." But I also remembered sitting on my therapist's couch, fidgeting with a tissue, listing things out loud. The yelling, the name-calling, the way my teenage anxiety was treated like an inconvenience. The time Dad called me psycho in front of my boyfriend because I cried at a joke. The way any attempt at a boundary was met with either tears or rage. "Your best still hurt me," I said quietly. My voice shook a little. That's why I needed space." Mum stared at me like I'd spoken blasphemy. "You've been talking," she said, "to people. About us. I've been talking to a therapist, I said. About me. About how I feel. Same thing, she said bitterly. Air our dirty laundry to strangers. Make us out to be monsters. I've never called you monsters, I said. I've said I was scared. I've said I was sad. Those are my feelings. I'm allowed to have them. The kitchen felt suddenly very small. I could hear laughter from the lounge room, the crinkling of wrapping paper, someone starting up Jingle Bells on the out-of-tune piano. You always were dramatic, Mum muttered, picking up the tea towel a little too forcefully. Even as a baby. Cry, cry, cry. I took a breath. My therapist's voice floated up again. You are not obligated to stay in conversations that make you feel unsafe. I'm going to get some air, I said. You just got here, she snapped. I've been here an hour and a half, I said, surprising both of us with my precision. I'm just going to sit on the porch for a minute. She rolled her eyes and turned back to the sink. Don't be long, she said. Nan will notice. The cool air on the front steps was a shock after the stuffy house. I sat down, resting my elbows on my knees, and let myself actually feel my body. Heart racing, yup. Shoulders up, yup. Jaw clenched, absolutely. I pulled out my phone. Mia had texted, "How's the hellmouth?" I stared at the keyboard for a second, then typed, "I'm okay." Tense, already counting down to leaving. Her little typing dots appeared. Then, "You want a penguin?" I looked back at the house. Through the window, I could see Nan's profile, Aunt's hands moving as she told a story, Dad's silhouette in his armchair. My family, my history, my trigger factory. I thought about Aunt's whisper, "You're so brave for coming." About Mum's accusation, "We didn't beat you." About the way my body had been in fight or flight since I walked in. I typed, "Not yet, but probably soon." "Running away already?" A voice drawled behind me. I jumped a little. It was Dad, standing in the doorway with another beer. He eased himself down onto the step with a grunt, joints creaking. For a second we sat in silence, the kind that used to feel comforting on fishing trips when I was a kid. Now it just felt heavy. "Just getting some air," I said. "You city kids and your anxiety," he said, half joking, half not. "In my day, we just got on with it." "In your day, no one talked about anything," I said. He snorted. "Talking doesn't fix everything." "Not talking doesn't either," I replied. He took a swig. "Your mum's upset," he said eventually. "She thinks you hate us." Old me would have rushed to reassure. "Of course I don't hate you. You're my parents." New me, wobbly, experimental, but here, took a breath. "I don't hate you," I said. "I needed distance." "That's different." "From what?" he asked, echoing Mum. "You." The yelling, the walking on eggshells, the feeling that my feelings were always too much. "From feeling like I couldn't breathe," I said instead. He looked at me, really looked, for the first time in a long time. "You seem fine," he said. "All this mental health stuff, sometimes I think it makes people worse. Tells them they're broken." I thought of my therapist's office, all those sessions where we picked apart my shame and put it back together into something like self-respect. It made me realize I wasn't broken, I said quietly. I was reacting to things that hurt me. He shook his head, like I'd missed the point. "We did our best," he said, the familiar refrain. "I know," I said, "and your best still hurt me. Both can be true." He made a face like I'd suggested we start speaking Esperanto at the dinner table. "You always did overthink," he muttered, pushing himself up. "Don't stay out here too long. People will talk." When he went back inside, I stayed on the step for another minute, my fingers hovering over the penguin emoji. This was the real moment, I think. Not walking in, not sitting at the table, not even talking to Mum in the kitchen. The moment I realized that being here was not neutral. It was costing me, and the only person who could decide whether the cost was worth it was me. I ended up going back in. I sat through presents and a half-hearted round of charades. I let Nan fuss over how thin I'd gotten and how the city agrees with you. I gave Aunt a proper hug when I left and whispered, Thank you for inviting me and for seeing me. She squeezed back and said, always, love. Remember, you don't have to come next year to prove anything. That sentence lodged in next to Aunt's first one. Brave for coming and you don't have to come. Two truths. I drove home through quiet streets, Christmas lights blurring a little at the edges because my eyes kept filling with tears I refused to let fall until I was parked. Halfway back, I noticed it. My shoulders had dropped. My breathing had slowed. My jaw had unclenched. The radio, which had been background noise on the way there, actually sounded like music. At a red light, I laughed. Came out a bit hysterical, but still. Aunt calling me brave for coming was sweet, in her way. But the braver act for me was going to be not coming back. Saying no next time without writing a 3-page essay explaining myself. Spending Christmas with people who didn't require me to fracture myself into palatable and too much. When I got home, I texted Mia. Survived. No penguin needed. But I don't think I'm doing that again. She replied instantly. That is the bravest sentence you've sent all year. So yeah. At Christmas Eve, Aunt whispered, you're so brave for coming. And I smiled, already planning not to come next year. Not because I hate them. Not because I want to punish anyone. But because I finally understand that bravery isn't forcing yourself into rooms that make your chest ache just to prove you can. Sometimes bravery is looking at the plate of overcooked ham, the too bright fairy lights, the family who will always think you're a little bit broken for needing what you need, and quietly deciding, I'm allowed to spend my holidays somewhere my body doesn't feel like an alarm bell.